Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today with Episerver's premium partner Amaze. Alex, their Chief Strategy Officer, will be sharing some key insights for marketers from their study, the Amaze Generation. We'll be taking questions at the end, so please do drop your questions in the Q&A box, and a recording of the webinar will be sent around tomorrow. So Alex, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this webinar. Thanks again, Danielle, for setting this up, and everyone from Episerver. Just to follow on from Danielle's comments, this morning's webinar is around marketing to millennials, and specifically to talk around a piece of work that we wrapped up last year called Amaze Generation. This is kind of an interesting project for us and something that's been very dear to our hearts, because we are often asked by our clients, who is the customer of the future? And to help answer this, we decided back in 2011 that we should actually start looking at children that were just kind of going to be going through sort of formative phases in their lives, where technology would really start to have a big influence on them. And we wanted to see how they adapted to technology, how technology adapted to them, and kind of how they would start to set the ground rules for being the customers of the future. We called this Amaze Generation, and this was a study that we did over a 5-year period. It was a longitudinal study. It was something that we felt by doing it over a long period of time, we could start to identify not just small changes each and every year, but that we could actually start seeing bigger trends when we came to wrap this up. This type of research plays very much into our agency vision, which is to inspire original thinking through a deeper understanding of technology and human behavior. It's kind of a way that we can really start to see, you know, from when we started as a business, as to, do people shape technology, or does technology shape them? The methodology was really, really simple. This was the first time we'd ever done something at this scale. So we organized this around trying to identify around 20 candidates that we could study over a long period of time. And every year we would bring them in for focus groups and one-to-one interviews. Now, I want to introduce you to the Amaze Generation. This was the core group that were with us for the entirety of the study. Now, obviously, 5 years is a long period of time, especially when you're really starting to talk to kids who are sort of around 10, 11 years old, trying to track them all the way through to early adulthood, 16, 17, 18. But the group that stuck with us throughout everything are the ones that we use for our final wrap-up report. So I'd like to introduce you to Nancy, Jacob, Ella, Spike, and Penna, and Nicole, Max, Caleb, and Eloise. Now, what I'll do first is just run you through the highlights of end-of-year wrap-ups as we came to meet with them and sort of ask them how their year had been, what technology had meant to them in that year. And hopefully you'll start to see a very interesting picture start to develop. So in 2011, which was the first year that we started the survey, the majority of everyone we spoke to owned a mobile phone. That was pretty standard, but only about half of them actually owned a smartphone. At the time, smartphones were very expensive, and in many respects, technology still wasn't really there in a way that they fully appreciated. I mean, the iPhone was up and running by then, but they were very expensive, and more importantly, the contracts to allow them to get online were often prohibitively expensive. We saw very much that BlackBerry and Facebook dominated, and again, BlackBerry really had an edge from day one, and through the BlackBerry Messenger service. That seemed to be the sort of the common way that kids of this age communicated with each other, both in school and out of school. And it's for this reason that we started to see that always on was absolutely always the norm. And when it came to their use of social media, Facebook was their #1 platform. And they did say to us very much that Facebook was something that they couldn't live without. And this was something that followed throughout the years, to be honest, and to give credit to Facebook. I think what we saw in this sort of first year was the idea of always needing to have your phone on you was really, really critical. And when we asked these kids in a focus group, how would you feel if you were to leave your phone at home when you went on holiday, we really started to see this trend of fear of missing out come out. I think most of them sort of threw their arms up in the air and said it would be the worst case scenario to go on holiday without your phone because you wouldn't be able to keep in touch with everyone. In 2012, we saw ownership of phones rise, and again, generally it was a BlackBerry handset that everyone had, and again, this tied up very much with what we saw with BlackBerry Messenger as being one of their primary ways of using chat. We saw that their online platforms of choice were still very much Facebook, but also YouTube and Google. Google was very much starting to be seen as instrumental in helping them discover, but more importantly, YouTube was a platform that really became their primary source of viewing, especially in the evening, where they would construct playlists of what they would watch in that evening, often to the detriment of TV. TV really got sidelined in favor of vloggers and shared content on Facebook. We saw that this audience were very conscious of their online image, and this is where we started to see the first sort of rise in this trend of self-editors. And I'll come on to this because this was a big feature when we came to do the wrap-up in 2016. We saw that this group were very much around collecting followers, not so much cultivating friendships through social channels. And we saw that always on for this group very much meant staying permanently logged into chat groups. And again, in the focus group for this year, we did ask the audiences what the impact would be of leaving their phone at home when they went on holiday. And the answer that came out really loud and clear was not being able to share their experiences in real time while they were away. This idea of content only being as good as the moment that it happened was something that we saw very, very strong, and this appreciation that after an hour or so, that particular piece of content was dead to them. In 2013, this was really the year that mobile internet broke. Now, we'd seen this in work we've done with a lot of our other clients, but in terms of this audience, this was the first time that they had affordable mobile contracts that allowed them to access the internet anytime, any place, anywhere. It was still predominantly through BlackBerry handsets. This was still a much cheaper way for them to get online as opposed to more expensive iPhones. But there was still a constant with Google, Facebook, and YouTube dominating in terms of their online channels of choice. But what we also saw alongside this was a real kind of importance of services such as Xbox Live, which is often overlooked as being a groundbreaking social space. This was somewhere that our audience would often congregate after school, talk in real time, but while they're playing games. And again, this acceptance of virtual spaces being as good as physical spaces was really borne out by this insight. Now in 2014, whilst we saw that most handsets owned by our group was a BlackBerry, everyone wanted an iPhone. People started to recognize in our groups that the iPhone was the simplest way to start taking full advantage of a lot of the services that were coming through, especially Instagram and Snapchat. I think Snapchat had just started, was really just starting to get off the ground in 2014, and Instagram had really consolidated itself as a content sharing platform of choice. I think one of the interesting comments we saw with Snapchat is actually to do with the interface, and we'd always found the interface quite inscrutable, very difficult to use. But when we asked the group why this was, they said, well, it's probably because it's not for you, it's for us, and we know how to use it. And that sort of idea of really taking ownership of digital channels and twisting them to their own means was something that we saw really loud and clear in 2014. It wasn't so much that technology was dictating how they behaved. It was they were picking on a particular platform and then really starting to twist it for their own devices. And it was a really interesting way to see how technology was being co-opted. Facebook was something they still couldn't live without, but I think it was very much, this is where the mobile internet really started to make its biggest impact and started to touch upon some of the bigger trends we saw in 2016. And then finally in 2015, which was the final year of our study, we saw that everyone owned an iPhone. It became the handset of choice. And whilst we still saw an importance for platforms such as Facebook and YouTube, it was absolutely Snapchat and, more importantly, Instagram that dominated social. This was one of the primary ways that they shared their lives online. We also saw that the internet was something that they used not just for their socializing, but also for practical things, shopping and also homework. And Facebook Messenger really supplanted BBM as being the primary messenger service of choice for this group. This was something they used to stay in touch with their friends in real time and became more important than even voice calls. So those were the highlights of the years of the study. But what was really important to us was to stop and take a look back and really think about what have we learned and what are the key insights that we can take out of this. And it was only by going back over all the studies from each year, all the notes from all the focus groups and all the videos that we took, that we really started to see a very, very clear picture that we think will determine what the importance of the millennial will be as we move into the future, and more importantly, how brands need to respond. So firstly, our first kind of big insight is we saw that the Amaze generation are fragmenting their identities and molding the digital world to get the most out of it. I think what we started to understand is that this audience are very mindful of being able to create different types of personas, either on the same platform or different platforms. That they may have a private network that is just for friends, but then they may also have a public network that is very much for the wide world. And this really challenges our perceptions of what we think of as a single view of customer and whether that's still important anymore. Because what we learned from this was that we really need to start to understand which version of someone it is that we're engaging with and on which platform. Now, a case in point is Eloise, who is one of the people that we followed over the years. And she was a really interesting character, given that we'd followed her from when she was relatively young, so she was about 10. She had developed her own private social network on Instagram where she had around 100 close friends and colleagues on there. And if you look at her Instagram profile, it's totally locked down. It's completely private. However, she also has another profile that's called Cat Puddings. And this is a platform that she uses to showcase her creativity and something she's really built up over the last couple of years. And again, she makes things, she presents them, and often people will buy them. And again, we picked this screen grab in particular because she'd created an iPhone case and someone just said, please take my money. And she'd built up a profile of 51,500 followers. And this was something she saw as the public expression of herself. This was a personality that she'd created. It was still her, but it was a way that she was able to present that to a much, much broader audience. Now, what was interesting was what Facebook then did with that data, because obviously Facebook owned Instagram. They knew that she had two personalities, and they actually then tried to mix up the two on her Facebook profile and start pulling in her private and her public followers from Instagram into her Facebook profile, which really rattled her because she was quite affronted that Facebook hadn't understood the difference between her private network and her public network. And again, we did feel that there was a lesson to be learned here around understanding who you're talking to, on which platform, and understanding what the rules of engagement are in that particular instance. And really understanding the privacy settings is really, really critical to this, because we have to address this generation as they want to be addressed, or we can really turn them off. And again, this really starting to think about the strive towards a single customer view, how relevant that is anymore. And I'll come on to this in the next point. But it really starts to challenge our perceptions of what CRM looks like, what a customer record looks like, and how much we want to know about someone versus what we want to understand about what it is that person actually wants from us at that particular moment. So the next insight that we saw was really to start understanding that this audience were very much personal brand builders, and they were really excellent content editors. Their understanding of when to post something, in what format, and what their expectations were of response were really, really startling. In effect, they're doing the job that we get paid to do by a lot of our clients, but they do this in their private lives. And this has actually shifted the balance in terms of who is online and what their role is. They had developed complex rules to dictate which platform is used for which activity, and they would often sort of cultivate and also crop particular posts if it didn't meet their exacting standards of performance. Again, there was a common response that we got when we asked them about posting, say, images onto Instagram. They will often say, well, if I post an image on Instagram and it only gets 40 likes, I'll cut it from my feed because my standard is 80 likes. And if I have anything that falls below that, it can actually tarnish my online image. Now, this can sound quite sort of worrying to think that people care this much. But once we started to talk to them more about it, we realized actually all they were doing was really looking at how digital is used to present their online self and doing it in a way that actually is no different to deciding what particular outfit they're going to wear on a given day because that's a particular image they want to present of themselves. So we found it really, really interesting that they very, very simply had decided this is part of me, and to get the most out of it, I need to make sure it presents me in the best possible way. This highlighted to us this idea of not trying to get too personal with followers. The idea of really thinking about knowing who this person is and where they are in the traditional demographic approach to segmentation. We actually started to see fall away in favor of actually starting to understand who this person is right now, what it is they want from us, and how we can really add value to them. Our next big insight was really around understanding the difference between these open and closed networks. So again, we really wanted to get to the heart of their desire to balance the need for validation on open networks with a secure network of real friends on their closed networks. And again, I think this really started to tackle the whole notion of their understanding of privacy. Privacy was never really an issue for the Amaze generation when we asked them about it. We never said to them, do you worry about what people do with your data? And they were very, very open to the idea that their data would be used for marketing purposes. But what they were very, very precise about was, it's my data, and if I allow you to use it in this way, that's fine. But if I say absolutely not, then you shouldn't use it at all. And again, this goes back to the earlier point around really understanding, are we talking to someone on a private network or on a public network? And do we understand who this person is at this particular moment in time? This again started to get us to think about, what do we value out of our CRM and our audience segmentation, and really to start looking at the quality of a customer base as opposed to the size of it. So again, our takeout from this was to really think about fewer records, but with a much more engaged audience, and really understanding them in the particular moment so that we can provide the best possible value to them. And again, personalization is not an issue. Some people get very funny about personalization, and I know that we all have to contend with new legislation coming through, such as GDPR, that will dictate how we can offer highly tailored personalized experiences on our website. The Amaze generation really didn't mind any of this, providing their data was used in the right way. But if it offered them products and services that they actually really wanted and they cared about, they were really, really open to it. And then finally, one of the final insights we saw was really around the notion of buying online. All of our audience were very, very much around buying via mobile, what they wanted, when they wanted. And one of the big insights we saw was that they weren't really that interested in offers. They were much more interested in seeing what they wanted and getting it immediately. Convenience was a premium that they were willing to pay for. They weren't really interested in things such as, big sale events. What they wanted was, if I see it, I want it, and I'm willing to pay for that. And again, it started to highlight the issue around price no longer being the consideration, but access being the consideration. And for us, this really started to get us to think about, well, what does the future of the sale look like? Will events such as Cyber Monday or Black Friday still be of importance if actually what we should be focusing on is providing the right type of products for our customers and then making access to those as easy and available as possible? And then the final insight we saw was actually one of the most startling. Often it's very easy for us, certainly in our industry, to think with a future sort of full of personalization, data, trying to get hold of personal data by any means possible, that we could be building this sort of dystopian future. But actually the Amaze Generation were very upbeat about what the future held. They certainly saw technology as a real enabler. They saw that it allowed them to do things and access things that previously would have been very hard. But what was also really interesting was that they understood the importance of switching off and actually living in the moment. And Penna, who was one of our subjects, talked about actually really loving going to gigs, and instead of holding her phone up and filming it for the whole event, actually just not having her phone on at all, and really starting to enjoy the particular moment and take that in and then just talk to her friends about it afterwards. And I think this really made us think about the way that often brands would like to be involved in their audience's lives, needs to maybe sort of take a step back and think about how we can do more with less. Not thinking about how can we force a message into every particular instance, but really thinking about which elements of an experience do we need to be a part of and which should we have absolutely nothing to do with. So just to summarize before we go on to questions, think around, followers will give you reach, which is great, but actually friends will deliver real depth, and actually getting to know the elements of your database that can really, in a really much more meaningful way, and actually start thinking, therefore, what value can we offer to that person? Understanding that our Amaze Generation audience understand the value of brand, content, and reputation, and we have to be really mindful of this. That we know which version of someone we're talking to on which platform, that we shouldn't be afraid of privacy, but we should be respectful of privacy. And again, that's a common thing that we've seen with a lot of our clients, is often getting too caught up in the intricacies of privacy, but actually not thinking about what can we do with it. Really rethinking what our segmentation look like. Demographics will tell you where your audience are, but their behavior will tell you where they want to be. So don't think about we need to target this audience, this particular age in this region, but actually think about who wants this particular product right now and how do we get it to them in the simplest way possible. Understand that lower prices, yes, will always shift product, but convenience will deliver premium and hopefully lasting relationships with customers. And then finally, knowing when to be there and when not to be there, and that being one of the biggest lessons we think that any brands can learn in the future. Now, there's just sort of to wrap up, this technographic profile was something that was used when we were kicking off the study back in 2011, 2012. This was really what the internet looked like in terms of who was creating content, who was interacting with it, and who was just spectating it. And what we saw with the Amaze Generation is about 95% of everyone we spoke to were active creators. And we do think there's going to be a dramatic shift to the traditional model of who contributes to the internet towards those that are pure content creators. And that will absolutely start to change the rules of engagement for brands. We're already seeing brands being much, much more adventurous in terms of the type of content they're willing to let out with their name on it. So the idea of rough and ready content is actually a given now. And that will only continue because this is the type of content that our audiences are already creating, that their friends are following and commenting on. And we have to understand that now this is a world that we live in. So just want to say a final goodbye to our Amaze Generation. They were absolutely amazing to give up so much of their time and, more importantly, their lives to really help us understand what the future will look like. My name is Alex Comyn. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Amaze, and I'd really welcome your questions now, please.
Thank you, Alex. I've got some questions here from the audience. So, the first one, there is lots of talk about raw content and how millennials want to engage with real content. Can you share some good examples of how this is working for brands?
I think raw content, well, obviously this has been driven by, I guess, originally the rise of Snapchat, and then also, I guess, more recently, Instagram. I mean, Instagram have pretty much taken the Snapchat platform and made it part of theirs. I think the brands that have started to do really well with it, Domino's have had a lot of success recently. They created some really cute content, which they called Door to Door. And again, although that was created as a brand exercise just to get some content out there, that actually started to deliver for them an uplift in orders. Again, it wasn't high production. It was sort of very basic animation, but it was something that really seemed to sort of catch a mood with their audience. They really seemed to engage with it. I think there's also some interesting lessons to be learned from the likes of, there's a rapper, DJ Khaled, who has a massive following on Snapchat. I think each of his pieces of content gets around 3 to 4 million views. And again, his content is very much of the moment. So he'll film himself watering his plants or coming out of the shower and talking to camera. And again, there is absolutely no production values whatsoever, but he's a very, very engaging personality. And I think a lot of brands are really starting to look at those types of that sort of production quality and really trying to emulate that. I think, I think that's where brands have pretty much understood now that you don't have to apply your own high production values to get real traction. And often, because you are creating content that isn't going to last forever, it's only going to live in the moment, you do want to focus on just getting it out there little and often and then moving on to the next thing.
Thank you. I have another one here. When you explored the future with your group, did you gather any insights around education, for example, subjects they like to study, career aspirations, etc.?
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, Jacob, who, let's just see if we can find him. Jacob is in the bottom right-hand corner. He was actually very, very vocal around the fact that the internet had opened up career possibilities to him that he'd never really considered or available to him before. So he was very much using Google as a research tool, looking for, these are things I'm interested in, does that translate into a job, identifying jobs and actually going for them. And he'd been pretty successful. I mean, he'd just started work in the final year and he'd got himself a job working in web support services. And when we asked him about sort of how he got that, he just said it was something that never would have occurred to him, was something that he could do, but it was able to help him to understand what the career options were, what qualifications he needed, and then he actually worked towards that. I mean, all of them we saw that we're using online for help in homework and stuff like that, but he was a really good example of someone that it helped him to understand what the future could hold in terms of a career. And I think some brands have really responded to this sort of trend really, really well. I think Barclays in particular should be called out for their online life lessons, as you were, that help sort of young kids start to prepare for the world of work and how they can use the internet in the best way to prepare themselves, whether that's through learning interview technique to even things like, cleaning up your social profile so it's presentable to a potential employer. I think, yeah, it was definitely a trend that we saw.
Great, thanks. And just to follow on from that question, you mentioned connect and isolation as an issue. Was teen mental health explored?
Mental health. Yeah, it was actually. There was one of the candidates in fact, there was a couple of the candidates that we talked to over the years had come, I hope I'm answering the question in the right way, that I've understood it in the right way. We had a couple of the candidates did talk about online bullying and what they'd suffered through that and the effect that it had on them. And that had sort of raised questions around the role of social platforms in helping to capture that and actually do something with that. It wasn't something we fully explored because we did want to obviously respect our sort of candidates' privacy. but it was something that they did sort of raise with us on more than a number of occasions. I hope I've answered that in the right way.
Thanks. If you do want to follow up to any of these questions as well, you can email them to me with my email details in the GoToWebinar, and I can then pass them on to Alex, and we can get back to you as well. There's another one here. So, how much or less of an influence is their relationship with their parents and/or figures of authority in their lives?
That's a really good question. I'll be honest. I mean, they didn't really talk about their parents at all when we were following them over the years. They were just there, you know. Their sort of families and their figures of authority were sort of ever present in the background. It just wasn't something that really came out in the study, if I'm being perfectly honest. We didn't particularly ask them. We did obviously ask them around the role of parents in governing their use of online, and that was absolutely a thing. But I think, to be fair, that was about as far as it went. Like I said, the bigger thing that did come out was sort of questioning the role of, say, Facebook or Instagram or Twitter in sort of governing things like online behavior and actually helping to manage that or not managing it, as is often the case.
Thank you. Do you have examples of how brands could use Snapchat to engage with millennials?
The examples, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of interesting examples that we'd seen over the years. I know Gatorade did some interesting work with the filters. They'd created, there's this thing in NFL when you get to the Super Bowl, one of the teams, I probably made a note of it somewhere as well, one of the teams, their tradition was if they won a game, they would to dump the contents of their drink case all over their coach's head, and they actually turned that into a lens they called the dump lens, so that, you know, while people were watching Super Bowl, this was back in 2016, they could actually film themselves having Gatorade dumped all over them, and that got something like 100 million views. And I think that was a good example of a brand understanding the particular moment and how to capitalize on their personal brand, but also then understanding what people were watching and what they would want to get out of that particular experience. I think it taps into, especially with Snapchat, I've always been a little bit sniffy about Snapchat as a marketing platform, because often I've seen some brands just dump adverts on there, and I'm not sure that always works. I think you have to provide sort of pertinent content that's actually mindful of the particular moment that that audience is in. And I think that's where sort of the smart brands, whether it's sort of Gatorade, Misguided, have done some interesting stuff as well. Like I mentioned Domino's before, where they're actually really thinking about a particular moment and how people are using Snapchat. That's where I think it gets interesting. Personally, I think Snapchat is really being sort of eclipsed by Instagram and Instagram stories in particular, and I know that a lot of brands are actually preferring that as a channel, one, because it's got so much more reach. I think it's some crazy stats now of around 95% of all social interactions are now happening on Instagram, but also because actually it supports brands better. You can link through to your own brand properties online, and you can also reference other followers on Instagram, which is something that Snapchat you still can't really do, although I know that they're addressing that.
Thank you. And what surprised you most from the study?
The bit that really threw us, there was two things actually. Living in the moment, I think we thought that was actually really nice, because we thought, you know, what sort of world are we bringing the kids into? What monster have we created with the internet? They were absolutely fine with it. And equally, they were very, very clear on when to turn off and actually just enjoy life, which was great. So that was refreshing. The big one for us was actually the complexity and sophistication of how they understood their online selves. So actually being so aware of when to post something at what time, what number of likes they should expect to get, being more than happy to go back and cull vast swathes of content from their social profiles to improve their online image was something that actually we were really surprised by, that they really had understood could make a big difference. That online was a place that now many people would meet them for the first time. You've got to remember as well, 2016 was the year they were just getting ready to leave school and they were going on to college and were starting to think about university. And some of the older ones who were going on to university were being asked all by their sort of future colleagues at uni, you know, can we see what Instagram account have you got? And then going back and cleaning those up. I think that was, for me, that was one of the most surprising ones, is the level of sophistication and understanding. You know, these people are, you know, they are brand experts, content experts, and we get paid to do this, and they do this for themselves all the time. So I dare say when they come onto the marketplace, they're not going to be wanting for a job. They're going to be doing very well for themselves.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we've got time for one more question. And that last one is, will you be continuing to follow the Amaze Generation for another 5 years?
I think it's something we've talked about. I think what we learned from Amaze Generation was we were very, very aware that we did it using people that we could get hold of quite readily, because we were mindful that we wanted to keep people on board for 5 years. If we were to do this again, which is something I would really like us to consider, I think what would be really critical is to probably do it at a bigger scale. I'd like us to maybe, one, address a broader set of socio-economic groups, because I think it's fair to say we're probably predominantly dealing with people from middle-class backgrounds or maybe upper working-class backgrounds. And again, I think we could do with a much broader socio-economic spread. I think it would be really interesting to run it across a number of different countries, especially the BRIC countries, are the ones that are really coming up fast as economic sort of powerhouses, and understand the role that technology is having on those audiences in those countries. I think what would be really interesting, one of the biggest drivers for us to do it again, would be obviously Amaze Generation was done with what we would term digital natives, so people who grew up with the internet. And if we were to do it now, we would obviously be addressing people that grew up with the mobile internet. So it'd be really interesting to see if there was any shift in mindset as going from the internet being a place you would go to, which the Amaze Generation started as, to the internet being a place that's always with you, which is what we would expect maybe to see if we were to run it again now. So yeah, I think it's definitely being discussed. I think the final thing we'd probably like to do is probably partner with an academic institution, so we could maybe be much more sort of have more rigor around it, to be honest.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. I hope we've answered all your questions. If you do have any others that come in, then please do get in touch, and we'll be sending around the slides and the recording tomorrow. So thank you everyone for joining us, and Alex, thank you very much for taking the time out to present, and yeah, see you all soon. Thanks, bye.
Thanks everyone, bye.